Nuclear power in shipping used to be a fringe discussion. Not anymore. It is increasingly being name-checked along with carbon capture as the only chance the industry has to reach net zero by 2050. So this week on the podcast, we are going to the atomic heart of the matter and exploring shipping's nuclear option. And to some extent, we're going back to the future here because back in 2010, all the major class societies had nuclear plans ready to go. Along with many other journalists at the time, I was being briefed by executives on the big nuclear push for shipping. There was a lot of detail there, and the plans to use nuclear energy at the heart of shipping's decarbonisation transition were very much ready to go. Then Fukushima happened, and the plans were quietly put back in the drawer, never to be spoken of again. The journey from there to here has been an interesting one. The same clean energy producers that were telling me that we needed a clear 2050 net zero target from the IMO to catalyse investment, well, they're less sure about that now they actually have it. Now we need a carbon price, they say. Oh, and even if we did have that, there is the energy density problem, so perhaps ammonia and hydrogen won't be enough after all. If only we had nuclear power and carbon capture. So the question really is this resurgent enthusiasm for nuclear a genuine maturing of the technology and the political readiness to take seriously the need for nuclear power to create green fuels and potentially scale nuclear-powered shipping? Or is this just the latest get-out-of-jail-free card for an industry that routinely relies on the silver bullet sitting just out of reach, just over the horizon? Is nuclear the politicians' uncosted election promise to an electorate desperate to believe?
This is going to be made available, and this is going to happen.
That's Mikkel Boe, Chief Executive of Core Power, the shipping industry's leading proponent of advanced nuclear reactor technology for maritime applications. Now, he's been a visible figure for several years, and you've probably heard him on this podcast, but the confluence of decarbonisation regulation and advancing technology have arguably thrust the nuclear debate into the mainstream. For the past 3 years, Core Power has been holding a summit in London. I was there with him this week, but this is now a significant event attended by very senior finance, insurance, political figures, and of course nuclear industry figures as well. This is no longer about something that might happen in the future. This is part of the debate alongside hydrogen and ammonia, but without the energy density conundrum.
It's going to be disruptive. Right? It's going to change. A bit like steam disrupted sail. It's going to be disruptive. And in order to be part of that, the industry needs to invest. They're already investing. We're going to need more investment in, yards and people and rules and regulations and technology. It's going to be a lot. And the industry needs to step up and use some of that money that it's made over these last 10 years and say, right, how are we going to invest in the future? And they're investing in themselves, they're investing in capabilities, they've got to invest in technology companies, they've got to invest in, those solutions that are out there so that they can learn from it and be part of it and not just wait until it's available. Because I think there's going to be a scramble. The demand scramble is going to be big and not everyone's going to get it when it comes. And that's something that I think is a big takeaway. You've got to get ready to invest in this new market.
So Mikkel and the Core Power gang are pro-nuclear and bullish, as you would expect. But it's not just Mikkel. There is a growing body of opinion across the industry now that is routinely referring to nuclear alongside carbon capture technology as the only real options on the table that will allow shipping to decarbonise within the timeframe of the 2050 targets already agreed at the IMO. For those of you who listened to last week's podcast from Posidonia, you will have heard Knut Orbeck Nielsen, the head of the class giant DNV, make exactly that point. But he wasn't alone. He was just one of many senior voices out there telling me bluntly that the sums for shipping's energy transition simply do not make sense anymore unless you factor in nuclear and CCS. This is part of the mainstream thinking on decarbonisation, whether people are talking about it or not. Publicly at least, and I'll come to that reluctance to talk about this openly in a moment. But as Mathieu de Tugny, Executive Vice President of Marine and Offshore Division at Bureau Veritas, pointed out to me last week in Greece, the technical readiness of nuclear is not really the big issue here.
It's doable at long term. But there are so many hurdles, in between that it will take time. First, of course, this is the availability of the reactor. Second, this is the supply chain, how to make it. I even don't talk about the cost, but you may have different leasing systems, to cope that. But probably the main important difficulty here will be, the public opinion. Can you install such, nuclear, system on board a vessel? It will be a big fight. I think it will be a big fight to convince the opinion, and as well to explain that, notably to the oil majors, that you're going to revolution, the supply chain in terms of bunkering.
We have a habit in shipping of looking at these big questions just as a shipping problem to solve, which, of course, this is very much not. So I wanted to get you a view from outside maritime for some perspective on this. Murto Tripathi is an energy transition specialist, particularly interested in the role of nuclear energy in the fight against climate change. She's not from shipping, but she points out that this is not a question of if shipping should go nuclear, but when, and where it sits in the queue of other sectors also lining up for the next phase of this nuclear revolution.
Well, the maritime industry certainly has to take nuclear industry the same way any other kind of industry in any other kind of energy-intensive consumption body of people or machines, which I'm referring to cities or urban areas or so on, will have to take nuclear seriously for the simple physics of it, which is if you have to go low carbon, which is already a requirement and is starting to become a legal requirement more and more, and will soon be an economic requirement because CO2 emissions are bound to be taxed heavily. There's not many other choices. You have the intermittent wind and solar, which are very diluted, also sources of energy and certainly not dense enough, particularly for an activity like maritime. You have geothermal and hydro, which by definition are geographically bound. Which obviously is exactly the contrary of what maritime shipping needs. And then it's left nuclear. Now, the good news is we've always talked about nuclear as being one technology. The reality is, behind it, is that it's a physics concept that actually translates in many, many technologies. And today, the conditions and the drivers and also the public and political awareness are strong enough that people start to look at all those nuclear options, and try to see where each can contribute best to the overall decarbonation. Now, maritime, again, not only will have to go nuclear because there isn't that many other options, because either they get it directly from propulsion, or they will need nuclear as the energy source that will make the alternative fuel that they will need anyway. So at any rate, somewhere along the process line, you will have some share of nuclear power being involved. So now maritime is going to need it, but the same way all the other heavy industries are going to need it as well. And you're going to have a lot of candidates looking for it. And the question really will be how fast the maritime industry can put its affairs in order, if I may say. Regulatory framework, human resources and skills, adapted to the dual world of on one side nuclear, on the other side maritime, and so on.
Okay, so back to Mikkel and the Core Power gang. And while many of you will have heard him or others wax lyrical about the revolutionary implications of next-generation molten salt core reactors, it's inevitably not that simple. These miniature nuclear reactors promise a future filled with local, clean, safe, zero-carbon energy. Great. So what's the hold-up? Well, there are voices out there saying they are too expensive, too slow, too risky for investors, and they're taking the focus off renewables. Mikkel is determined to prove the naysayers wrong, at least by 2030.
Well, I don't think there is a blocker, Richard. I think it's a question of technology. All technology has its time. And we had the first electric vehicles in the 1890s. They didn't catch on. We had them again in the 1950s. They didn't catch on. There is a certain maturity to these things, right? Maturity and time. And I think what we're seeing now is we've had nuclear for 80 years, actually 82 years now, and it's evolving. It's coming through. We're taking some of that knowledge that was accumulated in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and all of the research that's been done on the back of that since. Remember, we've had an industry that hasn't really evolved very much, because of cheap fuels in other areas. But we're now at a point where we can take that knowledge, and that knowledge is large enough to build these new technologies. And I think it's not so much about politics driving it. It's not about regulations driving it. It's not about opinion driving it. It is technology driving it. I mean, it's new technologies, new innovations that demonstrate that we can solve that other side of the equation from decarbonisation that then has politics follow it. Politicians will say, oh, that looks good, we'll follow that way. Regulators say, well, that seems to work well, let's put some standards in place and allow that to happen. Finance will come, insurance will come, the demand is there. I mean, we've got 300 people in the room here today, and we're still just 6 years into this. So, give us another 6 years, Richard, and we'll see where we're at.
So nuclear may have been perceived as something of a fringe topic for the past decade, but that's changed over the last few years. And if Mikkel and Myrto are right, this is inevitable. It's just a question of how fast shipping can get its house in order.
It wasn't mainstream for one very good reasons, is that it was not competitive. And there was no reasons to go specifically to a non-competitive alternative, which was seen as highly complicated, probably not so easy to gain the public or political acceptance around it, and so on. And maritime has that additional constraints, which could be turned into an advantage, we can talk about it later, which is that it needs to comply with the regulations of many countries at once. And nuclear has had an issue of already complying and being made acceptable to one geography at a time. So now you meet with an industry who has to make sure that whatever technological progress it proposes, it puts forward, it is acceptable to all the different ports and harbors where it's going to land at some point. So it is an additional difficulty, which I understand up to now probably was seen as a barrier to entry of nuclear in maritime. But now with a low carbon requirement, and if you add to it the environmental footprint, which is air and water pollution, also, which are direct contribution, I was going to say consequence of maritime, the nuclear option will become and needs to become much more than an option.
But back to the specifics of shipping. As we noted during last week's Posidonia bonanza of new ship orders, a lot of ship owners are currently pulling back from alternative fuel options in favour of conventional fuel designs simply because they just don't believe the current timelines on availability of supply. Could it be that nuclear now has an opportunity to leapfrog these fuel routes? Well, Mikkel says he's already talking with owners on exactly that possibility.
I am, and there's a big disparity between the answers that are made publicly and those that are given privately. And my personal opinion is that it's not a leapfrogging, it's avoiding a detour. Because if we go down the route of ammonia, for example, it's a noble idea, but ammonia production as it is today from natural gas actually produces more CO2 than the entire shipping industry. So if we do that with ammonia that's produced from natural gas, shipping goes from 2.5% of global carbon emissions to 15% of global carbon emissions, and surely that's not what we're here to do. So you've got to then go down the green route, and the green route is just one that I think people are seeing. They're seeing the viability of investments in that. I mean, you're creating an energy source that is less than half of what we have today, and that really destroys the other side of that equation, the competitiveness. How do we remain competitive unless everybody does it? I think here with what we're doing is that you're creating a new competitive advantage. You're creating a disruptive advantage. You're creating something that has the opportunity to achieve an awful lot more than what we're doing today. It's not just a straight line from diesel-powered shipping and shipping as we have it today, but it moves into a completely new realm of what shipping's role is in the global economy.
Okay, I know what some of you out there are thinking, and with all apologies to the nuclear crowd listening, you're just going to have to raise your eyebrows and look exasperated while we tackle the question that everybody's really thinking about, and that Mikkel, unfortunately, has had to repeat patiently in almost every interview he's ever done. What about the Houthi rockets? What about the pirates? What about the nuclear-powered ship that ends up in the hands of bad actors in a dark fleet? Is there a safety and security problem here?
Well, I mean, it's always going to be a problem for shipping. I mean, pirates have been around for hundreds of years, and we find different ways of dealing with them. It's a couple of things. One is this perception that somehow the safety aspect of an attack on a nuclear ship is different from one on a conventional powered ship or a tanker or a container ship or anything like that. And I think that's a sort of snake that needs to be scotched. I mean, the destruction of a nuclear power plant on board a ship is something that is almost impossible. You have the way that the systems are created and the way that they're packaged means that the entire vessel could disintegrate around it without the destruction of that power plant. And that power plant would then be sitting inside that box. It would, if it went to the bottom of the sea, it would stay there. It wouldn't leak out. And I think, one of our panelists today pointed out that, radiation doesn't spread. The radiation's a force field. It's not contagious. It doesn't move around like chemicals and that kind of thing. So, the perception of what that means, I think, is overblown. It's not more dangerous for a nuclear ship to sink than for any other ship. I mean, there's no pollution from it. That's one thing. I think when it comes to security, it's a different thing. You have this perception of security and that somehow bad actors could get hold of a nuclear power system and use it for something. And again, you have those systems that shut it down before that happens. That's one. You have enhanced security measures that you can have on vessels that have nuclear systems on board. I mean, we're back to steam. Remember, steam's a powerful deterrent. We have a lot of electricity. That's a powerful deterrent. And we have, many other ways of dealing with this. Avoiding piracy areas is clearly a good way to avoid pirates. But, it's an endless discussion of minimizing risk rather than avoiding it.
Look, I'm not going to pretend that shipping's nuclear option is an easy one, or that it is ready to go. But equally, we know the difficulties that lie ahead with all of the pathways towards the clean energy transition in other fuels. Mikkel and an increasingly large and well-informed body of industry opinion offer a very compelling case for nuclear being a significant part of that mix, certainly as a land-based facilitator of green fuels, but also as a propulsion technology that comes with serious upside. The hurdles are well known, but I would argue no less surmountable than many of the mountains left to climb for the full welterweight zero-carbon revolution ahead elsewhere in our plans. At the very least, I would argue that nuclear is now shaping up to be a mainstream part of the debate on how we get to 2050. My thanks to Mikkel, Myrtle, and everybody who talked to me at the nuclear conference this week. Genuinely a very fascinating and interesting day out. I would highly recommend everybody attend next year's. So, thank you for listening. As ever, feel free to get in touch with your views, even the slightly ranty ones complaining that I am a know-nothing blowhard who should shut up. Richard.meade, that's Meade, at lloydslistintelligence.com for all your considered criticism and fan mail. Until next week, goodbye.